Welcome to another tidbit from the Bible. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen, and this quarter we look in particular at themes from the Gospel of John. And today there are three themes covered by the material we have received: Jesus as the bread of life, Jesus as the light of the world, and Jesus as the resurrection and life. These three belong to the many I am statements in the Gospel of John. Now, to trace these themes throughout the Gospel, it would be a good idea for you to simply take the Bible, read through, and then make a note every time life or death, light or darkness, or bread and water is mentioned in the Gospel. And you will find that we cannot cover all these texts for a short tidbit. But I will move back to the beginning of the Gospel, because before we move into the narratives in which you find the expressions, we should look at what is told in the prologue, the mighty poem that you find in the first 14 verses of the Gospel. Let's read, and I am using the English Revised Version, from chapter 1 in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. A clear statement of the eternal divinity of Jesus Christ. He was not created, he was the Creator himself. And then, verse 4, in him was life, and life was the light of man. Here you have two of the themes for today: life and light. These expressions in the prologue remind us that there is a larger story. The true light, John continues in verse 9, which gives light to everyone who is coming into the world. In all this, he associates with the creation account in Genesis 1. And then, he was in the world, that is Jesus, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, but his own people did not receive him. Now, the themes of life and light, which you find here from the very beginning in the Gospel of John, and that permeate the whole Gospel, they introduce us to a larger story. The story about Jesus, who had been forever one with God from eternity, but who came down to earth. And we find that larger story whenever we look at the individual themes or text or identification markers by Jesus in the Gospel of John. Let's move to the first theme for today. That is, I am the bread of life. That statement we find in chapter 6. And we find it in verse 48. Now let me find it here in the English Revised Version. It's very simple. At first, easy to understand. I am the bread of life. Now, note that this statement by Jesus is spoken in the context of a narrative in which Jesus had just been feeding the multitude. In other words, in the storyline in the Gospel of John, the theme of bread is connected to the story about bread. The multitude returns to Jesus the day after the miracle. They were disappointed. They had intended to crown him as king, to force him to become a king, because whoever doesn't like someone who is able to feed them. And Jesus is scolding them, because he wants them to see that the bread that he's giving them is a symbol of something larger. Notice how he continues in verses 49 to 51. Your father ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am that living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. So note that in the Gospel of John, in the storyline, the expression, the statement by Jesus, where he identifies himself as the bread of life, is found in context of a narrative about feeding with bread. But in the words of Jesus, there is a larger story. The story about him who came down from heaven. That is what you have told in the prologue. The one that was one with God, who came down from heaven to earth. Now let's move to the next episode and the next identification marker by Jesus in the Gospel. As we move from chapter 7, we'll find that from 6 to 7, we'll find that Jesus here adds to the fact that he's the bread of life by speaking about himself as a living water. And bread and water, of course, is a pair that goes together. This is a nourishment. In this case, the spiritual nourishment given by God. Now, as you move to chapter 8, Jesus in verse 12 expresses the famous words, I am the light of the world. This is in continuation of the Feast of Tabernacles. During the wilderness wandering, God walked with his people as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of light. And on the temple, there were illustrations with lights of the fact that God was their light. And then this is what Jesus refers to. I am the one who followed you in the wilderness. I am the one who led you out of darkness. I am light, not only for you, I am the light of the world, because Jesus expands it. He expands it because what he's doing is he's placing the theme of light in a larger context. In the Gospel of John, as with the story about the bread, the theme of light is told in the context of a story. We will see that a little later. But Jesus connects it to something that is larger. Now, what is the story? As you move on in chapter 8, there is a long and profound theological discussion with the Jewish leaders about the identity of Jesus. And then in chapter 9, Jesus heals a man who is born blind. So the fact that Jesus is the light of the world is now illustrated by his healing a man who was born blind. And in commenting on this healing, Jesus takes us into a larger setting, to the larger story. So let's read from chapter 9, when Jesus, in verses 39 and onwards, speaks with the Pharisees. He said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Blindness is commonly used in the Gospel of John, as in the other Gospels, about spiritual blindness, about rejecting Jesus, about unbelief when listening to the Gospel. And Jesus here connects this seeing and not seeing, to the larger context, to the bigger story. For judgment I came into this world. So just as in the Gospel of John you find that these expressions of who Jesus is are linked to narratives told to illustrate. So Jesus in his words connects the themes to the large story about salvation. He came down from heaven to earth. Let's look at the last theme for this week's study. We find that in chapter 11. Jesus visits the tomb of Lazarus. And the sister, one of the sisters of Lazarus, Martha, speaks with Jesus. He challenges her about her belief in resurrection, and then to her reply, he says to her, we are reading from verse 25, I am the resurrection and life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Here you have a very, very clear connection between the statements by Jesus about his identity and his power and the narrative told. The story of the death and the resurrection of Lazarus. But note also that Jesus connects this theme to a larger context. He says, who lives and believes in me shall never die. This goes beyond the story of Lazarus itself. So in the Gospel of John, these themes are illustrated by narratives that speak about bread and light and seeing and death and resurrection. But in every case, Jesus is connecting this to the larger story, the story of salvation. He was one with God for eternity, but he became a human. He came down to earth from heaven to save, to give us bread and spiritual nourishment, bread and water, to make us see, understand and believe, and to give us eternal life, now and forever. Thank you for listening to this tidbit from the Gospel of John. We will continue next week with a focus on the prologue, the first part of John chapter 1. Thank you for being with me.